Well, good morning to everyone. Please have a seat. Welcome to CIPA. Welcome to Columbia University. My name is Mauricio Cárdenas, and I am a professor here at CIPA, and I direct the MPA in Global Leadership, which is a new program that CIPA is launching for mid-career students. It is a great privilege to introduce this session with Minister Mario Marcel and with Gray Newman. Gray is going to be conducting the conversation with Minister Marcel. Let me say two words about each one of them. Mario Marcel is a longtime friend and has an amazing CV. I think it's the dream CV of every single student in the public administration. He's a business engineer from the Universidad de Chile, has an MPhil from Cambridge University, and has a long career in public service. He's been director of the budget in the Chilean finance ministry. He's been board member of the central bank, president of the central bank, and since last year, minister of finance. He's also held very interesting and important positions in the issues of institutions, governance at the IDB, the World Bank, and the OECD. So you can already see the breadth of his career and his experience. I think he's one of the very few persons I know that has worked in all these organizations. Welcome to CIPA. It's a privilege to have you here. I want to thank the institutions that have made this event possible. First, Invest Chile, which is a great initiative to promote the capital markets in Chile. Very commendable. The Columbia Global Center in Santiago de Chile. ILAS, our Institute for Latin American Studies. The Columbia Business School, and our own MPA in Global Leadership, and the students, which are very important to have these events. And let me mention them by name: Juan Jose Silva, Diego Charlin, Leah Reich, and Juan Carlos Eizaguirre. So thanks to you for your help and your collaboration. Gray Newman will be conducting the organization. Gray has been very close to CIPA, teaching a very popular class here. Gray was managing director and chief economist for Latin America at Morgan Stanley, but he held that position as chief economist for Latin America in a number of banks, like Bank of HSBC, Merrill Lynch. So very knowledgeable on the issues of the Latin American economies. So with that, I want to welcome both of you, and we'll have time for questions at the end of this session. So Minister Marcel, once again, thanks so much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for attending the session this morning. The format is the following. We'll have a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to your questions for the minister as well. And we'll conclude with a few remarks from Columbia's very own Mauricio Cárdenas. Chile, for many years, I would describe Chile as the Chilean paradigm. The Chilean model was market-friendly economic policies, strong growth, macroeconomic stability. And that's the Chile that for decades I heard and studied. You don't hear much about the Chile paradigm today. Today, I would suggest the Chile paradigm has been replaced with the Chilean paradox. And the paradox is why, despite all of the policies put in place during the Chilean paradigm, we've seen the kind of social political upheaval that led to the protest in 2019, led more importantly to a new constitution. And as you know, in the next little less than 7 weeks, Chileans will be going to the polls to vote in favor, approval, or rejection of the new constitution. And so the first question I have is for us to step back and look at what happened to the Chilean paradigm. Is it despite the policies, the Chilean paradigm, that we've moved into the Chilean paradox, or is it precisely because of some of the policies during the Chilean paradigm that Chile has arrived at the Chilean paradox? I always tell my students that before you can look forward to where we're headed, you need to look at what happened to bring us to where we are today. Starting points matter. And so my first question is a little bit of a historical question. I'd love to get the minister's take on why is Chile where it is today?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Columbia University and SIPA for inviting me. I've been here a few times before. It was as governor of the central bank for the seminars organized by Guillermo Calvo with central bank governors after the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. So it's great to be back and to share with you some thoughts and some evidence and some recent developments on Chile. And you pose this question of paradigm, from paradigm to paradox. I think that that's a very interesting headline. I would, well, this would require perhaps far more skills than an economist may have. There have been thousands of op-eds, editorials, books written about the social upheaval of 2019, so I don't intend to compete with that. What I would say is that from the perspective of an economist, what I could see in that process and then connecting to the current agenda is that Chile, since I would say since the middle of the first decade of this century, began a process whereby this paradigm was increasingly challenged on a number of dimensions. And to start with a very economic one, what you can see from the perspective of economic growth potential and economic productivity is that the growth potential slowed down from 5.5% per year by 2005 to 2.5% today. So that's 3 percentage points of potential growth that disappeared during that time. And then you can wonder how that happened. So part of that had to do with human capital, but the larger part was due to a deceleration and then stagnation of productivity. If you average out the last 10 years, average productivity growth is close to 0 in Chile. How did that happen? Is that a result of policies or misconceived policies or what? If you trust, I mean, I can rely on some work that we did at the central bank a few years ago. And what you can see there is that, first of all, from the point of view of firms, productivity, the alternatives to get overall productivity to grow, that is replacement of firms, or the increasing gap between more productive companies vis-a-vis the more stagnant ones, vis-a-vis growth in firms. It is this last component, the one that contributes the most to deceleration of productivity. So in other words, you have different segments of the economy. You may have firms entering and some others disappearing, but one important engine of growth, of economic growth and overall productivity, which is more productive firms growing faster than less productive ones, is something that did not happen. Secondly, if you look at the labor market, you can see that in Chile, there is a lot of labor mobility. So for many years, economists wrote papers about how severance pay or whatever contributed to weaken the labor market or weaken firms. But the evidence is that severance pay costs did not deter firms and workers from moving around. Actually, in Chile, about a third of the labor of workers, change jobs within a year. But what is more important about that is that when workers change jobs, they don't necessarily move to better paid jobs, and they don't necessarily move to more productive jobs. They don't move necessarily to more productive companies. So there is a lot of movement within the economy, but somehow there are a number of barriers to get the normal processes of productivity growth working. And finally, you have natural resource-based industries, starting with mining, where on the one hand, you have an almost, physical factor of declining productivity of mines the older they get. But also you have industries that are very intensive in water, very intensive in energy, and sometimes can be very polluting. So increasingly, some of the most dynamic sectors in the economy began to hit some of these constraints that had to do with the quality of life and the use of natural resources for a number of purposes different from only mining or other activities. So what that suggests is that the way we were growing over time became increasingly exhausted, and then that we needed some kind of change that could diversify our production to generate a renewed insertion into the world economy, being an open economy as we're still today. Part of that is happening. If you think of Chile 20 years ago, we were heavily dependent on imported oil and fossil fuels. We were entirely dependent on that. We had a couple of crises in between with the import of gas from Argentina. We had a number of episodes like that. But 10 years ago, our energy matrix started to change. And today, from a time when about only 5% of our energy came from renewable sources, we are already at 25. And in the next 5 to 7 years, we will get to 50%. That is because technology has evolved in a way that makes solar power and wind power much cheaper to produce. And then we may end up in 10 years from now from being entirely dependent on, let's say, dirty sources of energy into being entirely dependent on clean energy sources, and we may become even an exporter of energy. So that is what may be opening ahead. So what I want to convey to you with that is that Chile is in a very important transition on the basis of its production, on its economic basis. That is not a negative transition, but that in the middle of that, when you are still transitioning towards a different base of production, you hit a number of bottlenecks. You remain dependent on imported oil. We are now. So this slower growth zero productivity growth is something that keeps resources flowing into the country, into society to resolve social problems that they accumulated over time as well. So I will give that that perspective from a very from the point of view of an economist that suggests that Chile's growth slowed down not because of bad policies, but because essentially our basis for producing and growing in the past became increasingly exhausted. But the good thing is that at the same time, new avenues opened, and we are currently in that transition. So it's no wonder that today foreign investment is still welcome in Chile, probably more welcome than before, because if we want to move towards clean energy, green industries, and so on, there is a lot of know-how that comes with foreign investment. When I receive lots of investors that have a number of projects in these new areas, Chilean entrepreneurs that are building successful businesses on areas that you wouldn't dream of in the past, built on the basis of knowledge, built on the basis of logistics, built on the basis of research and development. Some of them are even got to Wall Street and they raised capital here, not in Chile, because there was not enough capital for them. So we are in that process. So we will feel some of the strains of that for a while, but it's important to see that the future ahead of us is not a mirror image of the past, and that we all of us have to learn to live in a different economic and social environment from the one that we were familiar with.
You mentioned living in a new environment. A new environment brings with it at times a level of uncertainty. And one of the issues when I speak with investors and others in this area is the uncertainty over the constitutional process. And it's 6-7 weeks before a vote takes place. There have been increasing questions over if the Constitution is not passed, if it is passed, what happens next? Leaving the Constitution aside for a second, but the uncertainty that this process creates, what tools, what is the role of the finance minister, and what can the ministry do to deal with that level of uncertainty, and how would you handicap that uncertainty?
Mm-hmm. Countries have constitutional processes once every several generations. So when I was born, not too close from now, the previous constitution was only 45 years old. And then in 1980, I voted in the plebiscite that was organized by the Pinochet government. Of course, it was with the losing vote. But I remember that at that time, the demand for an open and democratic constitutional process was already there. And we are talking about 1980. Our President Boric recalled President Frei Montalva's words in 1980 at one gathering in Santiago to reject the proposal of the constitution from the dictatorship. It is, I think, pretty interesting that in Chile this social upheaval ended up or moved towards an institutional process to build a new constitution, something that you don't find in many places. Some people say, well, this was the political system that tried to resolve this in the way that they knew. But the political agreement was pretty broad, and the people understood that and supported that. In the referendum of 2020, 79% or 78% of the people voted for a new constitution, a new constitutional process. And now, if you trust the polls, support for a new constitution, adding up people that are in favor of the proposed constitution, people that are in favor but would like to see further changes, and people that would like to reject but to restart the constitutional process is larger than it was in 2020. The reject vote today in the polls from people that want to remain with the current constitution is lower than it was in the referendum of 2020. Today, it's 18% compared to 22% in 2020. So even after all, the complexity of the constitutional process and the way people saw the constitutional body to behave and so on, even after all that, even after discussing things that were not common in our constitution, still people want a new constitution. And that will be the result of the referendum in September the 4th. The result of the referendum is that we are going to have a new constitution, either the one that was approved or proposed by the constitutional body, either that with some amendments, or a new process that will lead again to a new proposal. So I think that's something that you can bet very safely on. Now, what can a Minister of Finance do in this environment? Well, we have to ensure that, given all the expectations that are set on that process, not only on the constitutional process, but also on this new administration from 4 months ago, you need to ensure that this change that people expect is done in an effective, structured, and sustainable way. We in Latin America have plenty of experiences of attempts at reform that failed because either the economy moved into a crisis, or because the public finances were unable to fund the benefits or the cost of reforms. So that's what I believe that the Ministry of Finance can do. That is what we have been doing, and we have been managing at the same time a difficult economic juncture at the time when we're discussing whether the world is heading to another recession, and at the same time we are fostering and supporting an agenda for change, like the tax reform that we submitted to Congress 3 weeks ago.
On the issue of the tax reform presented to Congress, I think at the beginning of this month, how important is that when we think of the social programs that have been discussed in the context of the new Constitution, and in terms of the goals of the administration? How important would you say the tax reform is? And if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the main, the highlights, without going into a full presentation on tax reform, because I've got a dozen more questions.
Sure. Yeah, well, tax reform is expected to raise public tax revenues by some 4% of GDP by 2026. What that means for the government's program, that is equivalent to about 50% of the government's program, including the increase in basic pensions, health reform, building of schools, building a care system, and then all the efforts to support small and medium enterprises, to diversify production, to do research and development, and so on. So it's 50% of the cost of the government's program. The other 50% would come basically from the fiscal space that we have created in the next few years on the basis of a responsible management of public finances and some efficiency gains from public expenditure. Now, what are the main features of tax reform? Well, first of all, it's a very ambitious one in terms of tax revenue. But it appears that that is perhaps a challenge that reflects the cost of people's needs after many years where the tax burden in Chile has not grown at all. The last time tax burden grew was back in 1990 in the reform that was introduced by the new democratic administration at that time. After that, the tax burden has remained around 18% of GDP, going up or down, depending more on the denominator rather than the numerator of that ratio. With that, in Chile, tax burden has grown more slowly than in the rest of Latin America, and we have a gap of about 8 percentage points of GDP to the OECD median. And that gap is explained mostly by personal income tax, that in Chile collects only 1.5% of GDP compared to more than 8% of GDP in OECD countries. So this tax reform is focused on individuals taxation, personal income tax, wealth tax. Then it includes a number of provisions to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of tax collection, reducing tax avoidance, tax evasion, cutting down some tax exemptions. Then we have a royalty on, or a redefinition of the royalty on mining, and finally a package of corrective taxes that will be submitted later in the year. And within that, perhaps the one component that I would underscore the most is the change to income tax, because for nearly 40 years we have struggled with this issue of integrating or not integrating corporate taxation with personal income tax on dividends. That began to change back in 2014. Then we moved to a semi-integrated system that was not, I think, a very effective response, because it made tax compliance considerably more complicated. So now, instead of continuing that in those dynamics, we are moving towards a dual system, whereby you tax differently income from capital as compared to income from labor. And for dividends, we will apply a flat rate of 22%, combined with a corporate tax rate of 25%. So that, if approved, that would create a structure upon which we can build in the future, without going back into this dynamics of combining taxes to make policy decisions, which I think is very complicated. And I mean, it may have been very useful in Chile back in the 1980s, where funding investment from corporate savings was the only way to fund investment, because the financial sector was in ruins after the 82-83 crisis. But now that we have a fully operational and effective financial system, that is not needed anymore.
When you look at you mentioned the difficult economic juncture that Chile finds itself in, and that as a policymaker, you find presenting the tax reform in this context, what concerns you the most about the Chilean economy in this current conjuncture, in this current moment? What is it from a policymaker perspective, putting the hat on as the finance minister, previously putting the hat on as the president of the central bank? What's the most concerning element in the near term for Chile to resolve, as opposed to the longer term, which the tax reform is intended to address?
Yeah, well, I think that today the world is experiencing a sort of aftershock after a 7.5 earthquake. In the case of Chile, that is not 7.5, but probably 8.5 earthquake, because it will combine with the social crisis of 2019. But in addition to the severity of the crisis, I think some of the issues that we face today have to do with the way in which the previous government between Congress and government sorted out or tried to support people to get out of the crisis. In 2021, Chile had the most expansionary fiscal policy in the world. 2021 was far more expansionary than 2020, even though the bulk of the crisis was in 2020. And that combined with this pension fund withdrawals that added up alongside the tax or government transfers, added up to some 25% of GDP. So within a year, with pension fund withdrawals and massive government transfers, we put 25% of GDP into the economy. And of course, the economy recovered fast, but then overheated. And then now we have to face the current inflation pressures coming from the factors that are common to many other countries, alongside having to cool down the economy because of this prior overheating. So you see, what you see is inflation pressures that have combined together to generate 12.5% inflation in the latest reading, a very large current account deficit. Last year was close to 7% of GDP. And then you have to cool down the economy at a time when there are many other risks around us, because the world is under a contractionary shock. There is no question about that. So we need to articulate, on the one hand, the macro policies to secure restoring a macro equilibrium with a contractionary monetary policy and with a very substantial fiscal consolidation, with mechanisms to support people that will be exposed to the larger costs from that kind of adjustment. So inflation takes a heavy toll on wage earners. There is no question about that. Job losses are not there yet, but usually, as you know, the labor market tends to respond to economic activity with a certain lag. So we are dealing with that. And the good side of it is that we started much earlier than other countries. I mean, in the US, the Federal Reserve started raising the policy rate back in March, after many months of arguing that the inflation was only transitory, that the averaging out over a long period of time would be enough, and so on. But it ended up raising the policy rate in last March. Chile started in July 2021, so it has a 9-month lead over the Federal Reserve. Fiscal consolidation is not happening in many countries yet. In Chile, we moved from a government deficit of 7% of GDP last year to a zero deficit this year. So we are doing our job. That would help the economy to adjust faster. But at the same time, we need to support people. And we are just about to approve one-off transfer to households belonging to the poorest 60% of the population. But you know, it is interesting that in Chile there are people that think that we shouldn't do that and we should do further consolidation. They don't even acknowledge that that is already happening. But anyway, I think that that's a way of dealing with this juncture. Of course, it's a very narrow path. It's not very easy to get the right balance in the course of that path, but it is important that we have the right, at least the right analysis or the right picture of what is going on.
Thank you very much. The title of this presentation was Chile at the Crossroads, a Path to Inclusive Development. And my hearing you, the path seems, as you described it, narrow indeed and significantly a challenging one. I just hope it's not a tightrope. I'm glad you didn't use that as the metaphor here. So I've got a dozen more questions that I wanted to ask. But in interest of all of you here today, I'd like to turn it over to the students and those who are attending this morning to have a chance to ask a question of the minister. We have a few minutes to do that as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Marcel, for your thorough presentation and conversation. I just had one question. I guess it is a role of every policymaker to put him or herself under different scenarios, right? So my question is, if you have thought of a scenario where the tax bill that you are presenting to Congress is significantly smaller, or in other words, given that you have outlined the challenge of building this scheme of social support for the population, for the long term for Chile, what would happen if you wouldn't get an outcome as the one that you're expecting after this tax bill is induced? Are there alternatives? What would be the position of the Ministry of Finance with regards to that? Thank you.
Well, I think that if you're relying on tax reform to provide the 50% or half the funding for the government's program, if you don't get any reform through, you would have half the money, and you can only do half our agenda. Of course, there are ways. I mean, there's still something that you could grasp from some further efficiency gains in the public sector, but something that I would not risk would be to increase public deficits and public debt. We are at a position that is better than in other emerging countries, with a debt of 38% of GDP right now, a little less, probably 7 to 8 percentage points less if you net out with sovereign wealth funds. But I think that moving above that is very dangerous. It's very dangerous in the sense that Chile is an investment-grade country. And if you lose that, well, everything will become uphill. Will be considerably more expensive to borrow for firms, to government, and the economy. There is no question that the economy will slow down. So we have to be thoughtful of keeping ours as a low-risk economy, because that has a number of longer-term benefits. Now, I don't think that, I mean, an outcome like that, I think that is very unlikely. I think that, I mean, I trust, first of all, that after the social crisis, many people from different parts of society, including entrepreneurs, employers, and so on, acknowledge that it was necessary to make an effort to provide the resources to fund social services and to resolve many of people's needs. So I hope that that will show up in the course of a tax reform discussion. I think that, you know, you spoke of, you know, the Chilean paradigm. There are many features of that paradigm that stay today. One of those is fiscal discipline and macro and the respect for macro equilibria. And if you think that, if you look for recent demonstrations of that, I think that the rejection of the fifth withdrawal of pension funds is a very clear one. You had, I mean, members of parliament had in front of them the most tempting gift, which is, you know, that just by pushing a button, you would put 4 million pesos in the hands of many Chilean households. But in the end, people realized that the dangers for the economy were far greater, that a measure like that would do more harm than good. And they rejected that by an overall majority for the first time in 2 years. So I very much trust that, you know, with enough cooperation, flexibility, and so on from all sides, we will get the tax reform through.
Okay. Okay. Sure, you can voice the spokesperson of the chat. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Minister, for your participation in this presentation. So I would like to get a little bit more in depth in the tax reform, particularly in the royalty for mining, particularly considering the topic of the paradox that we've been talking. Number one, we know that currently we don't have enough supply to fulfill energy transition regarding the demand that it requires, right? For 2040, we will need 4 times the amount of essential base metal commodities to fulfill energy transition for sustainable development. Moreover, companies such as BHP have announced $10 billion of investment in Chile. And so regarding the paradox and the effects that a royalty in the mining sector will cause, considering the competitive position of Chile as a mining country, right? And the effects that it will have also in the reserves of ore that we have in our country as well. I would like to get your take on how this will affect the competitive position that Chile currently holds as a mining country. Thank you.
Yes. Well, royalties, I mean, has a number of features. Royalties exist because what you're trying to do is to change the distribution of economic rent from the exploitation of a non-renewable natural resource, right? So there are many ways of articulating that. And of course, you're not alone in the world. There are other countries that apply the same. And as you know, we have a royalty on mining since 2005. So it should be clear from that experience that introducing a royalty as such is not an impediment to investment per se. It has more to do with the way it is designed, the size of it, and the comparison with other countries. What we have proposed is something that combines an ad valorem component with a royalty on the operational margin of mining companies. Whether we stroke the right balance or not, whether we have the right basis for that by making it dependent on the price of copper, or as a company suggests, dependent on different degrees of or size of operational margins, is something that is open for discussion. We do not claim to have the final word on that. The final word will come once we get through the legislative process. So we will be very happy to learn exactly what is in that design that may deter investment, and we will see if there is a room for adjustment. For us, important thing about the royalty on mining is to rebalance this distribution of economic rent towards the country as a whole, and to use the proceedings from the mining royalty to fund regional development, to fund research and development, and a number of things to contribute to make the Chilean economy more competitive and more productive. That is the purpose of what we're doing. If we find an alternative design that takes us to the same result, we will be very happy to take it.
Well, let me read a few of the questions that people are watching this through Zoom. I'm going to select a couple of them. Felipe Vial asks the following question. Minister Marcel, last week I saw a presentation of Undersecretary Sanuesa, and she showed a slide with the diagnostics used to propose a new tax reform. One of the points showed was the gap in personal taxes between Chile, 1.5% of GDP, and the OECD average, 8% of GDP. So why not tax everyone? I think this goes to the question of the tax base for personal income tax. And a question by Juan Carlos Dominguez on whether a new constitution is really the answer to the social problems Chileans are facing. Let me just leave those two now.
Yeah, so starting with tax reform, the gap between Chile and OECD countries has a number of factors explaining that. Of course, the size of the tax base is one. And we know that in Chile, we have an exempt minimum that is relatively high in absolute terms compared to advanced economies. It's not just relative. It's not just relative to their per capita income, but it's also higher in absolute terms. Now, of course, that has a lot to do with the tax history of the country, ours and the advanced economies. I mean, this is not comparative statics. This is, I mean, you cannot just jump from one place to another without acknowledging, you know, the fact that in advanced economies, people are prepared to pay tax because all of them get some kind of a benefit from the government, some kind of service from the government. But we have lived over many years with targeted social policies that was necessary at the time when you had very limited resources. I think that in order to move to a broader tax base, you need first, prior to that, you need to show people that they can share on the access to government services and that they can get quality services. And only after that, I believe you could think of broadening the tax base. I think that you cannot do that only on the basis of promise. So that will be, I think it's a challenge for the future. It's not for this tax reform. But if we do not change income tax in the way that we are proposing here, you will not get to the broadening of the tax base either. You cannot tell people that they will start paying income tax while at the same time people in the upper brackets of income pay lower tax. They pay lower VAT tax compared to their income. Usually they can take advantage of, many of them, have structured companies and societies and corporate structures that lead to lower tax payment. I mean, that's not something, it's, what I'm describing is not a sin. I'm not criticizing people for that, but what I'm trying to address is the political economy of this. That is that if you're going to tell people that they will have to start paying income tax, you have to ensure people that richer households also pay income tax, and that and probably that they pay a higher proportion of their revenue in income tax. At least that is what we collected from our social dialogue prior to submitting these proposals. So as long as people see fairness and reciprocity from the government, the easier it would be to broaden the tax base. And then on the Constitution as a solution to people's problems, I think that, at least what polls tell you is that people do not expect miracles coming from a new constitution. As the process has evolved, people have realized that there are a number of deeper institutional issues built into a constitution. One of the most heated discussions were not about the social rights, were about the political system. And that was one of the most contentious episodes of the constitutional process. I remember when this all started, many people said that, the greatest danger for the constitutional process was that the central bank could lose its independence. And at that time I said, look at the Constitution. Central bank is 2 articles, compared to a whole chapter on the political system, the structure of powers of the state, and so on. You let this process move ahead, and you will realize that that will be the heart of the constitutional discussion, not the independence of the central bank. And that is what actually happened. In the end, central bank ended up with a set of rules that are pretty much the current ones. What is contained in those 2 articles in the current constitution, plus a few issues taken from the constitutional law of the central bank. But the political system, the structure of powers, of course, that took a lot of energy in the Constitutional Convention. And some people that don't like what came out, don't like precisely the proposals on the political system, the structure of the legislature, the re-election of presidents, something that is not common in our political tradition. So in the end, it was not the promises of benefits or immediate benefits what has captured the constitutional discussion, but rather the essence of any constitution.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to bring this to an end. But before we do that, let me say 2 words. Paradigm or paradox. Let's look at the key features here. A progressive, when an outsider president is elected with an agenda that is a clear mandate to reduce inequality. A high-flying technocrat is appointed as finance minister. That gives comfort to markets and to business. A tax reform is proposed, ambitiously with the idea of increasing revenues by say 4 or 5% of GDP. That's unheard of in recent times. That is not just Chile. That's just also what happened in Colombia. So maybe we're in search of a new paradigm here. The paradigm of how to run governments with a more inclusive agenda, bridging inequalities, giving the state more capacity, especially on the fiscal front, but at the same time, providing comfort, stability to markets and to investors. That's the new paradigm. Mario Marcel is perhaps the person trying to build that, because being a finance minister in this environment is not an easy challenge. Finance ministers always have a difficult job, but being at the crossroads of an ambitious progressive agenda with groups in government that had been historically underrepresented, but that have big aspirations and big ambitions. But of course, there is always limited resources. And also, at the same time, understanding that to fulfill those expectations, you need more revenues. There's nothing more tense and difficult in the job of finance minister than enacting tax reforms. This is a contact sport, but what leaves you with more bruises is tax reforms. And I can tell you, being an observer of the tax systems in our region, that this idea of moving directly towards a dual system between the corporate income tax and the dividend tax is the right one. So I commend you for doing that. I think that's the necessary step. I was finance minister in Colombia when we introduced the dividends tax, and it was a very hard and difficult issue. And it was just a 10% dividends tax. Now you're thinking about going to 22, if I heard that well. At the same time, you have to keep investment flowing, because that's essential to this new paradigm. And that means having the private sector engaged. I think that's the one aspect that is most important. I think that's the reason why you're here in New York, to give that type of confidence. My view is that for that to happen, clear message, well articulated is central. So this is important for our students. Explain well, but at the same time, you need to avoid mistakes. You need to avoid making announcements that are half-cooked, that are preliminary. You need to avoid responses that are dramatic, like what happened with the exchange rate last week. I think it's important that you provide some stability. I also think, we didn't touch on that, it's not your current area because it's the central banks, but I think what Chile did to stabilize the exchange rate was remarkable. It's also part of a paradigm where central banks intervene when they need to. And what we have seen with the exchange rate in the past few days, I think it's also an important thing. So it's a paradigm in construction, and it couldn't be in better hands than with Mario Marcel at the helm of the Ministry of Finance in Chile. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your support.